Today, we're here with experts joining us for a conversation on the current state of the industry, the impact that sheltering in place is having on consumer behavior, and the role technology is playing to smartly meet consumer demand for doorstep convenience. I am pleased to introduce our panelists, and with doorstep convenience done right, we're very excited to have Drizly CEO Cory Rellas join us. For those who may not be familiar with Drizly, or you're not part of the thousands who have just started using the platform in the last month or so, Drizly is an application that connects consumers with their local alcohol retailers for purchases that are delivered by the retailer within as little as 30 minutes. So thank you, Cory. We know this is an extremely busy time, and we appreciate you joining us to share your insight.
Thank you for having me.
So consumers obviously are rapidly driving change on how wine and spirits are sold in this country, which is evident in Drizly's business. And with this increase in sales and the different platforms and the channel shift that we've seen in the crisis, we are all interested in what wine and spirits are trending. For those insights, we welcome Dale Stratton, SipSource Senior Analyst. Dale spent 12 years with Constellation and 22 years with Gallo, giving him tremendous experience in the industry. Dale, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Michelle. Good to see you.
Yeah, we're excited to hear more about what SipSource tells us about consumer behavior. And rounding out our panel is a familiar face to our WSWA members, Joe Moak, WSWA's Senior Vice President and General Counsel. Joe is an industry expert on the very complex beverage alcohol legal landscape, and I'm glad to have her here to add to the important context of legal and regulatory changes that we're experiencing during this pandemic. Joe, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here with everyone. Thank you.
And to all of you who are in attendance, and for those of you who are going to be watching this recording, thank you for joining us. We hope you are well. At the end of this webinar, we are going to open it up for questions, which you can submit in the Q&A feature that's on the control panel on your screen. We welcome members of the media who have joined us today. Everything is on the record. You will have an opportunity to ask questions as well. And should you have any follow-up questions, please contact Michael Bolello, WSWA's Senior VP for Comms and Marketing. Michael's email is michael@wswa.org, although I presume most of you have his contact information. So one last pitch, don't forget to follow WSWA on social media if you're not already. Glad to see and interact with you there on all of our social channels. Okay, so let's get into it. Cory, let's start with you. Tell us about the growth you've been experiencing. Particularly, I'm curious, was it a rapid growth as the shutdown orders were put in place, or has it been a steady growth that we've all settled into as we're in this social distancing lifestyle?
Sure. It largely followed the psyche of how I think we all worked through this moment. And there was a moment in time where we didn't know exactly what work from home was going to represent, the fact that we were going to get to shelter in place. And so, earliest parts of March, call it the first 10 days, we saw a lot of repeat consumers transact on Drizly who were sort of preparing for that moment, but there wasn't a necessary awareness shift in e-commerce for alcohol and Drizly specifically. Getting into the second and third weeks of March, things changed rapidly. And so we ended up basically scrapping our entire year and saying, how do we meet this moment? Because all of a sudden we had new consumer awareness and acquisition that was 10, 12, and even 16 times what we had budgeted prior to this moment. And so it was much more of how do we put in place the capacity? How do we work with our retailers to be able to reach all these consumers who are trying to order from home? And to put it in perspective, we've acquired more new consumers in the past 6 weeks than in the past 16 months in total. And we did all of that without any marketing. We turned off our marketing spend. This is all referral and social and people helping people and thinking about what services can actually reach them while they're at home. So it's been an incredible moment, and one where we've really had to change the way we work with the supply chain and with our retailers to be able to meet consumers where they are. The last couple of weeks, I think we've leveled off in the second growth rate, the derivative growth rate, but are still seeing massive growth. I mean, we're still about 8 to 9x what we had budgeted this year on a dollars perspective over the last 2 weeks. So it's been interesting. I think the coming months as we start to open up, various businesses will be a little bit more telling about what the new normal is. But as of right now, we're still full go on that type of growth rate.
That's amazing and so fantastic to hear. So you've talked a lot about that consumer growth rate, or the people that are using the app and getting in. What about your retailers? Are you growing in retailers? And what role, for our wholesaler members who are on this call, what role can the wholesalers play in helping connect you with more off-premise accounts to engage with Drizly?
Sure, two good questions for us. So I think the first one is retailers are our window to the consumer. And a lot of what we've done in the past years at a consistent growth rate was build the technology to bring them online, allow them to do delivery safely and smartly. And at the flip of a switch, with awareness now going up, we've had to meet capacity not only with making each retailer on the platform more able to meet this e-commerce consumer, and there's a lot of things that go into that, but also adding new capacity. And new capacity means not only the ability to get delivery there, but selection and pricing and all of the characteristics of an e-commerce consumer that they see in other categories, bringing that to alcohol. So those are the two pieces. We are needing, based on projections today, we are needing to triple the size of our retailer network to even keep up with the on-demand consumer who is ordering from home. So that is a complete game changer in terms of capacity itself. And I think that's really where the various constituents of the three tiers can play a great role in helping not only the consumer side, but keeping independent, local, and sometimes chain retailers' doors open in this moment. So I think from the WSWA side, just a couple quick bullets. One would be, we are three-tier compliant, and I think that sometimes gets lost in this message. So we are trying to use technology to enable the three tiers. We're not trying to change the status quo. So to that extent, we actually think we can be a real positive for your business and the brands that you're trying to work to deliver to consumers through the retailer. So awareness is a big component. And speaking to retailers about if e-commerce continues to be 5, even maybe 10% of off-premise sales, there's no longer a time to say, I don't necessarily have a strategy for e-commerce. And we have all the technology and the onboarding and capacity on the Drizly side to bring this industry online from the retail base up. So I think it's really utilizing the three tiers and the touch points to build awareness for what we can do for them.
Right. That's great advice, and I think a good thing for us to think about. I know I've appreciated learning from you the importance to increase sales for everyone to have multiple retailers on the platform. Mm-hmm. So good to see that.
Yeah, it's been fascinating, and I think we're going to need, even in cities where we've done well, we're going to need significantly more capacity from retailers. And just to put it in perspective, the average retailer on Drizly in the month of April is going to do about $35,000 of product transactions. Some 100, some 5, but the average being 30 to 35. It's making a meaningful impact on their bottom line and keeping them open in a time of need.
Right, which is great to hear. Great to hear positive economic numbers for some of these businesses. So sure. Let me switch to you. As Cory's talking about all of this, it's really all on consumer convenience, that same day service. And so it's great what we're seeing in Drizly, but can you tell us a little bit about how compliance and convenience coexist really in all of our 50 states?
Absolutely. Well, I think we're really lucky that we have a system in the US that's actually really quite unique. It doesn't exist in any other country in the world. I would even say that it's kind of distinctly American. Over all these years, it's really adapted, it's grown, and it's created this amazing marketplace that we see, where we have thousands and thousands of brands, and not just American products, right? We have products from all around the world. And so year over year, we see a lot of new brands, but we also see a lot of new innovation, a lot of concepts that come to our marketplace. And you don't see that in any other country. I have family that live in France, and I've been visiting them for over 20 years now. When you go to a grocery store there, I see French wines and just French wines. And then you see spirits, but they're the large traditional brands. So what really makes our system pretty unique is everybody's an independent company, right? And each has their important role. So we have what Cory alluded to before. We have these producers, we have distributors, we have retailers, and each of these companies is separate. So for example, you have a Diageo, they cannot own Breakthrough Beverage, and neither of those two companies can own Bevmo. And because you have all of these different independent companies, each having their own focus, it creates this really highly competitive marketplace that we see. And that really kind of forms this foundation where you have all this innovation that comes on top of that. So we certainly see it in brands, and we've seen the catapult of craft brands over the past 10 years. But you also see it more recently in e-commerce as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even think you have to look far to see how successful this system has been, because you look at the grocery store aisle for soda, and for decades you have two companies that really dominate, and there hasn't really been much innovation there. So our alcohol ecosystem's been really successful.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I too have heard suppliers talk about how the U.S. system really is a fantastic marketplace for them, and certainly very profitable, which is great. But let's push on that a little bit, because we also hear criticism about how all of these laws and regulations, and every state having their own set of laws and regulations that companies have to deal with, that actually feels like a restraint. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Our alcohol system isn't just about competition. I mean, states have they have these other really important concerns, right? They want to keep the public healthy and safe. They want taxes paid. They also want to encourage consumers to drink responsibly. So on the one hand, you have these states, and they want to have a thriving alcohol economy, but not at the expense of increasing individual or societal problems. And so in our industry, we're kind of always aware of this balance, and it's not always easy to maintain that. And certainly e-commerce has created, certain pressures to change. But I really do believe that our unique alcohol ecosystem, it's versatile and it adapts. So without taking any of the safeguards away, states have allowed retailer delivery, and they've allowed e-commerce. And so you can maintain all the benefits that our distribution system provides, but you can also give the consumers all the convenience that they experience with a bunch of other products. So with this innovation, consumers can order alcohol online for delivery to their homes from their local retailers. And given this pandemic, I can't stress enough how important local is. I know that I've become more conscious and concerned about really helping those businesses in my community kind of stay afloat and keep up and running. So, when you use e-commerce sites like Drizly, it really connects you to your local retailers, but also you can be sure that those sales, the taxes behind those sales, will go to the state, and that revenue is going to be more important than ever, certainly. But always, so kind of going back to the balance of things, those local purchases, they also support this kind of thoughtful system states have put into place, kind of these safeguards against the potential negative impacts that the abuse of alcohol can create. So for me, it's really a win-win situation for kind of the alcohol system, for states and local communities, and also for consumers who get this convenience. I mean, I think our alcohol system is often misunderstood, but it is really adaptable, and it gives consumers local delivery options, and it allows e-commerce sites like Drizly to thrive, and that's really proof of its versatility.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate your perspective and insight. I think now, Dale, I'm going to turn it to you, because as we're thinking about what Joe's talking about, which is really how do these businesses survive and ultimately, we hope, thrive. And we've seen that there's been this tremendous shift in the way people are behaving with the sheltering in place, as well as on-premise being virtually shut down. I look to you to talk about what is the SipSource data showing us. But before you kind of get into that question of what the SipSource data is showing us for all of the participants that are on the call, I think it would be helpful if you talk about why the SipSource data is unique and also valuable in reporting that on and off-premise data during this crisis.
Makes sense. Thank you, Michelle. So I think when you think about what makes SipSource unique is that you can get the full picture between the on-premise and the off-premise. So we're capturing retail sales, but also digging deep into the on-premise. And the on-premise has always been a very, very difficult place to get data and to understand what that data looks like. Because we have this also coded at a sub-channel level, you can start to differentiate the trends between bars and restaurants versus dining establishments versus recreational establishments. And then I would say on the retail side, when you think about wholesale clubs, liquor channels, things like that, they tend to be underreported in syndicated data. So SipSource is able to give us a view into all of those. And as we go down that path, I think it's important when we start to think about what's happening in the current conditions that you have the full context of the retail side, but also understanding what that impact looks like from an on-premise standpoint. And that leads us to what does the data show us? And early on we polled our members, and we saw in the month of March a 50% decline in depletions into on-premise accounts. That was in March. So starting in March. We're working on the April numbers, but we anticipate that on-premise sales are going to be down 95%, something in that area. So as this slide shows, spirits on the left and wine on the right, I was a bit surprised as to really the immediate impact in what we saw on channel shift. But then, and this is 12-month rolling data, depletions, and ending with March. So the shock of how much of a dip there was and the immediate channel shift that we saw was a bit shocking to me. Then took a step back and thought about it and said, you're closed for 2 weeks. 2 weeks divided by 52 weeks in a year, that's 4% of your year. So it really starts to add up, and when you start to think about what that looks like. Now, we had been seeing softness in the on-premise channel, and you can see that, especially on the wine side, you see that softness with pretty deep cuts. But we saw it even happening with the spirits category, and the spirits category has been performing very well. But we saw that softening, but it really dropped unbelievably in that 2-week period, had a major impact. So when we start looking at April data, that impact with them being closed is absolutely going to be severe. I'd also point out that the sub-channel that we saw, one of the bigger impacts, was actually in bars and nightclubs and on the spirit side. And not every week during the course of the year is equal. And when you think about that shutdown that happened, bars missed St. Patrick's Day, huge day for them. It was right at the start of the what would have been the kickoff of the NCAA basketball tournament. That's huge for recreation. Think about all the arenas that went to zero that were going to have those big events. And that, of course, is also very, very big for a number of players out there. The NCAA tournament in that bar and casual dining atmosphere. So the impact was very, very severe, and we anticipate continuing to see this happen. But it's important to point out this is channel shift, right? This isn't necessarily an increase in consumption. This is people moving out of on-premise and moving their purchasing into retail.
Really, really interesting, Dale. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Cory, since you're looking at it in real life and Dale is the analyst looking at the numbers, I'd love your opinion on looking at this SipSource data. Does this resonate with you? Is there anything that you wanted to add to his analysis?
I think you're seeing a lot of the same trends. I mean, we definitely saw liquor take share relative to other categories in the earliest moments of people working from home and shelter in place. And then, past that, we've seen it largely go back to the pre-COVID categories, macro categories, but subcategories have changed. And I think even on a more micro basis, we've seen things like gin take share relative to vodka. We've seen kind of a cocktail culture almost establish itself at home, to where you're seeing liqueurs and some of these mixers growing 2x what the rest of the business is growing, and really taking share from other pieces of it. So that's a little bit more on a micro side of things. We've also seen a little bit of premiumization at the beginning times, now receding a little bit more towards the macro products that are actually doing very well in the 3 tiers of getting on the shelf, and availability is important right now. So can go into all of that in more depth, but I do think we're actually very complementary to what Dale is saying, just on a slightly more micro basis.
Right, great, glad to hear. Dale, was there something, I saw you were got lots of really interesting data slides. Was there something else you wanted to highlight or talk about right now?
We can come back. Well, one thing I would say is that twice a year we do a survey of industry leaders and look at that. And one of the questions, we got a questionnaire out there and asked people, and you can go up one more to the, do we think that the sales in the retail side are going to actually offset the sales that are being lost in the on-premise? And the majority of the people are saying realistically that you're going to get some of that back. That is absolutely going to happen. You have 9% of the respondents that say that they will get it all back, and actually 13% believe they're going to exceed it. But as you can see, there's a bit more of a bearish view here, in that more people believe that the net of this is going to be less sales over the long run.
And Dale, as you were talking about this, there was a question that came in: is are we talking dollars or are we talking cases?
This is volume, and I think something that Cory brought up there is everything that we see still tells us that premiumization is happening. That we continue to see price mix improve, and that mix is getting better. So we would anticipate that it's probably a little more even sharper in terms of dollars than it is in volume at this time.
Right, which will be an exciting feature that's going to be added to SipSource for everybody in the future. Absolutely. To see that that price category move. That's great. So Joe, let's switch a little bit to talking about how we've really seen this. You were talking before about local retailer, and how has, in your opinion, businesses like Drizly's really worked to keep those local businesses strong?
Oh my gosh, Drizly, I think, and other companies certainly like it. They make it relatively easy for retailers that have no prior e-commerce exposure to quickly plug in to a ready-made e-commerce site. So as a local kind of independent retailer, even if you have the time and the money to create your own e-commerce site, you still have to work on getting all the eyeballs to that site. And e-retailing actually requires an entirely separate set of skills. They're just different strategies that are involved, everything from the look of ads to placement. There's a lot of trial and error in that. And then once you have that down, then you have the orders coming in, and a store needs to then be able to organize all those orders, and then the delivery routes, all while servicing kind of their in-person customers. And then you have customer support, because people usually have something to say about the way products are delivered to them. And none of these things come very easy. So, when you have a retailer like Drizly, who really has years of experience, these local retailers who use them, they have a huge leg up. First, you already have kind of a large, and what Cory said, a growing consumer base. And I would pretty much guess that a lot or most of these customers are not existing customers of these stores, and they just don't overlap. And then the local retailer doesn't have to worry about the e-marketing or the customer service, because companies like Drizly, they handle all that. And then Drizly kind of also gives back-end expertise, so help on how to handle deliveries, help on just how to handle issues that invariably come up. So I think as the country has become a lot more comfortable with e-commerce over the past 6-7 weeks, you have these companies like Drizly that really offer a ready-made e-commerce solution, and it's really easy for retailers to just take advantage of that.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. One of the questions that came in as well was really how can wholesalers help the retail partners get into Drizly beyond really just even getting into Drizly? Are there digital assets that they can provide for the different types of e-commerce sites? Do you want to talk about that at all, Joe?
Sure. I think there's a lot that wholesalers have. They certainly have a lot of product library materials that can help both the retailers if they have their own sites or work with companies like Drizly. And then they just have all of this kind of branding knowledge that still is very relevant when it comes to e-commerce. So wholesalers definitely have a lot of resources for both retailers and companies like Drizly to really get up and running much quicker than they could if they were just doing it by themselves.
Right. And I think it's a great place for wholesalers to really explore and expand is how are you serving your supply chain well by providing those assets to your partners that are really useful. So that'll be a nice development in the industry as we continue to strengthen that muscle. So Cory, all of this really has to feel good. You're providing this e-commerce solution for so many of these businesses during a crisis that's been relatively turnkey, I think, for so many of them. And you're working to grow your business. Do you have plans to be in all 50 states? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think the first thing is we are absolutely blessed to be one of the businesses that's succeeding in a really tough and stressful time. And there's humility and then there's also responsibility in this moment. The better we do, the better the retail partners and I think the supply chain overall will do. And just to talk to the model one more time, we're just digitizing what's on the shelves. And so to the extent that we can all work together to bring more retailers online, their shelves online, and then put brands in a place to connect with consumers in a 3-tier compliant digital format, I think that's a benefit across the board. Really what we've done over the last, but what we benefited from over the last 6 weeks is an awareness shift. I think we've accelerated the awareness of this industry, which was only 2% online, call it $2.5 billion sold off-premise every year, to at least 4% and potentially higher. And if you think about what that means, you're talking about another 2.5, maybe even $3 to $5 billion shifting to online in the coming months and years. That's massive. And when you think about what that means for a retailer, on a Friday night for a retailer that's doing $100,000 of e-commerce, that usually means you're going to be doing 100 plus orders per hour. That's a massive change in the supply chain. That's a massive change as to how retailers are thinking about their shelves, how to solve not only for the in-store consumer, but then effectively be a distribution center for the e-commerce consumer. So there's a lot within that, which then speaks to regulations. And I think you're seeing states who have been a little bit hesitant to want to understand what e-commerce is, how it might actually up the transparency and potentially even provide a more safe solution for consumers, entertain this conversation in the way they haven't. So we're seeing multiple states think about temporary solutions. I can, to some extent, say that if they have a good experience there, I can't really imagine a reason why it wouldn't become a permanent solution. And it really starts to look a lot like other categories. You saw Uber go into states, consumer groundswell, expecting that category to come online. I think you're starting to see consumers expect this category to catch up to many of the experiences they're getting in Amazon, grocery, restaurant, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, even for those of us that still use taxis, I expect my taxi to have an online app. I want that same kind of Uber experience, even though I'm using a taxi instead of an Uber. So it's an interesting thing to think about, that mind shift for people, and great to hear you talk about really this change and potential growth area for the off-premise retail. One of the things, just getting to that growth area that somebody had asked in the chat, is when you had talked about the $35,000 average sale per month for your retailers. The question was, what was it before our March and April timeframe?
Not a number I'm going to have exactly off the top of my head, but we had many fewer retailers and a smaller business. I'd say it'd be between $7,000 and $10,000 on average, skewed depending on, honestly, if a retailer wants to embrace the e-commerce movement, wants to utilize the tools and the data available to them, and those that lean in do better than those who don't. And that's what we've seen only accelerate in today's environment.
Right. So potentially doubling that e-commerce business, or tripling even.
Tripling, yeah.
Yeah, in this day and age, everybody wants to find those moments. So, and we're getting also lots of questions from our wholesaler members that are here. And you talked about it a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about those who are interested in helping Drizly fill in that retail gap, how they may do so from your perspective?
Sure. So we have a retail sales and account management team, and we have a front-facing portal at retail.drizly.com. Happy to send that out afterwards, which is basically a site that allows retailers to see what we do, how we think about pricing, the technology and the tools, and then get basically put into a backlog for our team to reach out, usually within 48 hours. It's been a little slower in the past couple of weeks, but we're now staffed up and ready to go there. So we take that very seriously, of getting back to retailers very quickly and seeing if there's a fit. And it's not always a fit. I think one of the things that's interesting is that the e-commerce forces of competition are different than the in-store forces of competition. And when you add transparency to selection and pricing and delivery times and service and ratings, and you can kind of go down the list, depending on how that store wants to perform and how they want to compete, they could do very well or decide they're going to focus on a different part of their business. But overall, I think it's incumbent upon retailers in today's environment to at least have an e-commerce strategy, and then with the flexibility of Drizly to decide how they actually want to reach that consumer and how intently they want to compete.
That's fascinating, Cory. I think you just gave me an idea for our next webinar to talk about those forces of competition being different in an e-commerce environment.
Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack there that would be really helpful. So that's great. Thank you. Joe, as we're talking about all of this, we're also getting questions from people that are participating that are thinking about the e-commerce environment and on-premise and how all of that shifted, and whether or not we see this, WSWA sees this as a type of solution to help these on-premise businesses and kind of where we're going. Can you touch on that for a while?
Yeah, that's something that we are definitely seeing in this crisis as states really start to adjust and have temporary relief measures, and they allow, for example, on-premise to give, sell to consumers curbside already mixed drinks in closed containers. And certainly we are talking about that possibility of, whether if that becomes permanent with our membership, what do we think of that? I think it's a really interesting relief, and it's an interesting option for off-premise retailers, and certainly things will become tough for them as they try and get their businesses back up and running with social distancing rules. So I think that these are areas where the system has opportunity to, again, be versatile and to adapt to this new situation and create some, ways to sell products for these on-premise retailers as well. I think it's a really interesting area that we're excited to look more into.
Right. No, it is interesting. And Dale, as we talk about this, and there's a lot of questions coming in on this too, but alcohol sales are up, but this new landscape change of on and off premise feels very strange and awkward for the industry to navigate. Can you talk a little bit about why this new landscape feels so challenging?
Yeah, and I think the first thing that I would say is time will really tell as to what degree sales are actually up. We certainly see significant amounts of pantry loading that are going on with our partner Nielsen, who's putting out a weekly report. Really starting to see right now in the last couple of weeks sales kind of start to level out, dispersed how you would think they would. Still significantly more growth in the retail side of things than there would be. But as these things open up and ease up, it is going to be interesting to see where it goes. And I think Cory touched on different categories showing different growth. And I think that is also one of the things that's very interesting as we think about our data and as we look at our data. Certain categories are much more leveraged against the on-premise than others are. And when you think about it from a wine standpoint, sparkling wine, with the exception of Prosecco, much more leveraged against the on-premise. On the spirit side, tequila, Irish whiskey, cordials, a much higher percentage than the average category out there, and those are really going to be leveraged. I saw a question that was posted there about the pre-mixed cocktail category, and pre-mixed cocktails have been showing significant growth in our data for some time here. But that data that's going to be accelerated. That is, pre-mixed cocktails, number one, completely almost 100% retail oriented. Number two is the cocktail culture is alive and well, doing extremely driving spirit sales. Well, some people will try in-home mixology, but others are going to take the more convenient route and move to that pre-mix. And of course, the quality of those have been improving. So I think that we're going to see that shift that's going to go on there. The basic habits of what people drink hasn't changed that much. We're seeing people continue to drink the products that they drink. They're just having to buy it in different forms and get it in different forms. And that's something that is likely going to stick around for quite some time.
That makes sense, but you're not making any predictions on how long we kind of see this stock up scene happening.
A little bit of bias. I live in San Francisco, pretty close quarters. There's just no place to put it. And when you see somebody at the Costco coming out, like, okay, I just don't know where that's going to go. And at some point in time, you're going to come back to a consumption cycle, and I think we're definitely challenging people's ability to shop. Shopping has never been something, grocery shopping has never been something that the consumer sees as generally as an exciting thing. Under the current conditions, that's even worse. So, I think that we're going to see that soften up a little bit.
Right. And as to your where do you put it, living in a place where I have the same space constraints, I always felt that way about toilet paper. But my attitude about that has changed. Find places to put it, without a doubt. I have Jake Hagman with WSWA is here monitoring the questions and answering those that he can. But Jake, as you've been reading the questions, is there anything that comes up that you see that would be interesting for our panelists?
Yeah, there was one that came in that relates to sort of the restart of the on-premise. And thinking to that, we heard a moment ago about cocktails to go, and sort of how the on-premise has pivoted. But if the panel could share their thoughts on what that restart might look like, and maybe initial waves and secondary waves of that restart. I'm not sure who to point that one to.
Yeah, who wants to take that one?
I'll take a stab at it. So, the first thing that I would say is that, and I saw a article or study that was Nielsen CGA, and their data is showing that 9% of those people who are purchasing takeout, delivery, or just pickup, 9% of them are including an alcoholic beverage in that order. So that 9%, that's certainly bigger than it was previously. So that has ramped up, and I think you're going to continue to see people participate in that. And part of that is out of goodwill. We all know that our neighborhood restaurant needs help. So we're gonna go that extra mile and buy those kind of things from them. I do think a lot of this is going to really hinge on the things that Joe talked about in Joe's expertise. Is those laws that are out there that have been that have been temporarily suspended. Are those going to come back, and what does that look like? And then I would also just say, from that standpoint, from an on-premise standpoint, I think those operators are going to have to adjust some pricing models on what they look at. How are they going to do that? What is the delivery vehicle that gets a cocktail to them effectively? Do I need to carry small sizes, single serve? Do I have one range that is in-house and one range that is for delivery? And do I look at those things completely separately? So I think there's a lot of questions that are gonna be asked. Some of them in the legal space, but if there was if there's one word that sums it up, the recovery is going to be slow. And, you know, I saw that I think Texas is going to be opening up May 1st restaurants, but at 25% capacity. So, you know, that's good, but it's pretty tough to make your business run on 25% capacity, and you're probably not going to get as many turns as you were of those tables necessarily. So
Right.
it's going to be slow.
All of those locations were built on a certain economic model, and that economic model doesn't exist for at least the near term. And I think that there is going to be some change, and that will affect how we need to serve those customers and help them find that space for growth. Cory, Joe, do you have a take on this question that you wanted to add in?
Go ahead, Joe.
No, just really quickly. I mean, you know, as just a regular consumer, not just somebody looking at all the changes and wondering too, what's going to happen when we start to phase into maybe less social distancing than we are now. You know, I have no predictions on what we're going to see, except we know changes are definitely going to take place. But it's interesting, just on the consumer side. I know myself, I feel like I'm spending less money. I probably am not, but you know, those dollars, certainly, like Dale said, I am much more willing to spend them on food and alcohol from, you know, on-premise retailers more than ever. And so I'm sure if I'm feeling that, a lot of other people are as well. And so I think we will see a change because of that.
Yeah.
Michelle, I had 2 seconds there, but we have looked at this space. And again, Drizly's model today is just working with off-premise retailers and the brands on their shelves. We've, out of a sense of responsibility to try to help restaurants and bars, thought about how we can direct our consumer base, our eyeballs towards the on-prem channel. The thing that's been a little bit difficult for us to wrap our head around is it's a different consumer. It's a different use case. And so our basket size is around $70 today. That is a very different thought process on purchasing alcohol than I just ordered food, I'd like to receive a cocktail at the same time. So while it may be the same consumer, the use case is very different. And we're trying to think about the length of legality as to whether or not that is worth the time and effort to be able to help in that space. But we are seeing it continue to rise. We're seeing a little bit of bleed between our consumers and the on-prem side. It's just a bit of an open question for us as to the legality of getting drinks delivered from on-prem, not just in 6 months, but more like 2 years. What is that going to look like?
You know, Michelle, one other thing that I would add, and we're talking about this purely at the restaurant level, but this does push all the way through. And the on-premise business is difficult. It's difficult for suppliers and wholesalers. Sales cycles are longer there. The assortments are tighter. There's fewer spaces to put product. Certainly, as we look at this, there are going to be a number of business failures, people who choose not to open up. We saw a pretty sizable move in the percent of business that was done, where the on-premise was accounting between 14% for wine and say 18% for spirits. If this slowdown continues all at once, you're going to be down there where same number of suppliers and distributors are going to be fighting for, instead of 14 to 18% of the business, fighting for 10% of the business. And so I do think it's going to be very, very important to be informed on what this looks like. And it's going to be a very, very difficult place, not only for the restaurateur themselves, but for the distributor network as well as the supplier network.
Right. Jake, do you have any other questions? And while Jake is looking through.
One follow-up question related to COVID.
Yeah.
And this one I think probably goes both to Cory, but have there been rebounds in terms of what you're seeing in trend-wise COVID, product purchase-wise, beyond sort of the macro premiumization?
Sorry, Jake, I missed the first part of that question. If you wouldn't mind repeating just the first part for me.
Sure. Just in terms of, have you seen a sort of regional shifts in purchasing, or are certain products or categories that are trending regionally in light of COVID?
Yeah, very much so. It's tough to speak to it individually, but you almost see the personality of cities in the data. And what we've seen there is for cities that were already higher beer drinking cities. I'll give you Denver as an example. That trend accelerated and then kind of snapped back to pre-COVID levels. But that's more of what we saw than anything else. Is whatever the city was exhibiting pre-COVID, those relationships only accelerated, and then they're starting to drop off a little bit now. I'm happy to provide data as a follow-up on a city-by-city basis as to how brands might change between them, but it is very unique depending on the market and the setup of that market on the retailer side, whether it be all independents, a combination of independents and chains, or maybe even some grocery markets that have different themes running through them.
Got it. Thanks.
So Jake, I think we should also talk about one of the questions that has come in that I know is on everybody's mind with really what are we seeing from changes generally after the Supreme Court decision on the Tennessee case? And then obviously all of the local changes that have been being put in place. Is there still that show of value for the three-tier model and the wholesaler as a facilitator in the beverage alcohol supply chain?
Absolutely. There's no question that certainly exists. And I would say probably today more than ever, as with COVID, we've seen just this huge shift in, on-premise products now having to really go off-premise, because certainly on-premise just isn't handling the type of business that they used to before. And without wholesalers kind of facilitating this change and really helping all these retailers adjust, it would be really difficult to see the pivot in sales that we have seen. So I think it is a testament to the whole ecosystem to be able to change really quickly. And we've had a ton of demand off-premise, and maybe that's not making up certainly for on-premise, the loss of on-premise sales. But like I said before, we have this very versatile ecosystem, and it really takes that community to make it all work. And wholesalers really help these retailers shift in these kind of uncertain times. So I think the value is certainly there. And the Tennessee case certainly was very pivotal. But as we've seen in more recently, the Sixth Circuit case, their state-based regulation is really important. There are a lot of good reasons for it. It's not just competition at any cost, but it's competition balanced with keeping the state citizens from public harm, keeping them safe, collecting taxes. All these reasons are still very important. And for those reasons, you need to kind of keep this smart regulation in place. And certainly each part of the system, it's not just wholesalers, but producers, wholesalers, and retailers, they're integral to keeping that balance in place. And that's, I think, important more than ever.
I think, Joe, on that note, there was some interesting points made in the Sixth Circuit opinion that came out last week about really that legal argument or justification. You want to touch on that quickly?
Certainly. And, that Sixth Circuit case, and it was basically on whether, a state can have in-state retailers ship to their, and wine retailers ship wine to their in-state consumers, but didn't allow out-of-state retailers to do the same. It upheld that law and basically said, look, the 21st Amendment really gives states the right to control importation and sale within their borders, as long as they have these important interests in place. They're not just being protectionist. And certainly, and this happened to be in Michigan, Michigan, as all the states do, they have these important interests of, trying to keep consumption at a certain level, but not too much, trying to keep their citizens, healthy and safe. And we see that certainly in times of COVID, the states are trying their best to do that as well. But they've always had that concern in alcohol. And because of this, we need to give states that flexibility to be able to respond to their own communities and what's going on in their state. And so that decision really reinforced the power of states to do that. And we see certainly echoes of that, in this COVID crisis as well, where states need to have that flexibility to do what's right for their citizens.
Right, that seems to make sense. And as we're talking about those safety protocols, Cory, can you talk a little bit about what you're doing to
Am I the only one that lost Michelle?
No, you are not. Looks like she froze up.
Okay. I think where she was going.
Or, yeah, the question was, can you talk a little bit about with this growth in the e-commerce?
You put certain safeguards in place.
Safeguard, right?
For
E-commerce safeguards.
So if you could just tell us what those were, what they are, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I think we did three things. The first one was really product related, and you saw all delivery companies do this really quickly, and I'm proud of our efforts here. And I think overall the industry did a nice job of what can we put in place on the product side to implement contactless delivery. Things like not having to sign on the Drizly app at the point of transmittal of the product itself, while also protecting stores, something we covered financially, from chargebacks and fraud. That was a big one for us. Two is around communication. Obviously, so many things are different right now, and you want to respect not only the wishes of the consumer who's ordering, but also the safety of the delivery person. So things like messaging ahead of time where the drop-off area might be, making sure that 6 feet are respected between consumer and the driver itself. And that took a lot of messaging and work to really change on the fly how we had done things previously. I think a second piece of what we had done is on the in-store operations, worked with the bigger retailers who really wanted to embrace this moment to separate in-store operations from the supply chain operations that are going for e-commerce. And that way you have different flow through your store and a different way of thinking about how your shelves can still facilitate a good interaction with the consumer who's walking in, but at the same time meet the 70 orders per hour for the folks who are wanting it delivered at home. And if you can separate those, there's a safety component and also a process component. And I think the last thing that we did, and we take very seriously internally as a purpose-driven organization, is we've invested our dollars and our time on the mental health aspect of this moment. Obviously, we want alcohol to be a social unifier in a time of social distance, but at the same time, we have a responsibility in a more stressful moment to help consumers think about where they can get education, awareness, and then if necessary, and we have seen this, get connected to people who can help. So we've done some work with 2 charitable organizations there, and I think that's been a big piece of keeping our team going and meeting this moment in a way that we think is respectful for the intent.
That's great. Thank you, Cory. Jake, I think we have time maybe for one more question before we close the webinar.
Well, I'm going a little bit off script here, but I'm aggregating a few. If you all want to deploy your crystal ball as we head to the close, what are your thoughts on what we'll be seeing in the next 6 months? Any big themes that folks here should be aware of? And also just to, I know a number of people, before we jump to that, a number of people asked for the slides. And I do believe this will all be made available afterwards. So if you did not get the graphics, they will be available after the call. But on the crystal ball note, for Dale, Joe, and Cory, what do you think the post-COVID, the top COVID takeaway is going to be in the space?
I guess I'll start it off since I don't see anybody else coming off of mute. Look, this industry is a microcosm of the economy itself. So how the economy goes is going to play a very, very big role on what happens with the beverage alcohol industry. So I would never begin to think about trying to predict where the economy is going to go coming out of this thing. This is without a doubt the single biggest event that we've seen in our economy in my life. So, but I do think it is very important that we watch what people are doing and understanding the trends. And more information is better. I think it's going to be very, very important as we go forward that we pick out the right data points to triangulate to get going. I do think in the context of this webinar, how people shop is going to change. And that the manner in which people acquire goods in general is going to be different after this than it was before it. To what degree that is and how that manifests itself, we're going to have to see where that goes, but it will be different.
Yeah, and playing off of what you just said, Dale, I completely agree, and certainly, you know, that shift in how consumers buy things, especially certainly alcohol, is going to probably cause a lot of changes in the way that alcohol is sold, shipped, and delivered. Certainly, you know, as we mentioned before, allowing on-premise to sell, you know, takeout mixed drinks in closed containers, I think is something that we'll probably see. But we also know that a lot of people are going to be fighting to kind of open things up a lot. And so we'll see what happens there with that.
And I'll stick with my immediate area, which is thinking around how does tech continue to enable pieces of the three tiers. So I think this is going to be important. And the reason I say this needs to be important to embrace going forward, prior to this moment, our data told us that 56% of consumers did not know it was legal to buy alcohol online. So that was like the first conversion event that Drizly always works on, is build awareness. And then a secondary conversion event of, well, why is Drizly interesting? Why is a shopping behavior? Is this potentially something I couldn't do in the physical world? And what is the value of that? So we talk a lot about how we're more than delivery. I think the supply chain overall needs to embrace this moment. If you look at other categories where awareness came from the consumer side, it's a very powerful voice, and one where the expectations there are not going to be kept behind other categories for any preconceived notions that we might think about on this call. Just like they buy clothing, just like they buy other categories, restaurant and grocery included, they're going to expect the same things out of alcohol now that there is a larger awareness for this particular category, especially being an essential business in a COVID era. So when that comes to fruition, where technology can integrate with the supply chain, where technology can match consumer standards relative to other categories is important. And I think it's not just important to meet consumers where they are, but I think it also protects the three-tiered system by solving for the end consumer and then backwards integrating through the supply chain. So it's a bit of a PSA for e-commerce overall, but I say that knowing that consumer awareness has grown to such an extent here that I don't think it can be ignored if we're going to continue the status quo, but just adding technology to enable it in a more effective way.
Yeah, I think that's great, Cory, and very well said, and the perfect way to end our webinar. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. WSWA is going to be hosting a series of webinars throughout the year on various topics with different experts, and we're looking forward to having you join us. Look for invites or evites in your inbox, and for those who are WSWA members, make sure to track us in the weekly buzz. If you have questions about getting the weekly buzz or membership, you can always contact Bob Wiggins at WSWA at bob@wswa.org. And with that, I'd like to give a big thank you to our panelists for sharing your insight, and to everyone else, thanks for joining us, and be well.
Thank you, Michelle.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.